The galaxy was burning, not in the way mortals might think of flame. No single ember or wildfire could ever match the scale of this conflagration. It was the slow, eternal burn of dying suns, the guttering light of star systems consumed by war, the quiet flicker of worlds whose names had been erased from all records, leaving only ash in the void. Above the fortress world of Cadia, the sky was weeping light. Not dawn, not hope, but the final embers of ships dying in orbit. Their hulls turned to glowing shards that streaked into the planet's atmosphere like the tears of ancient gods. In those tears, there was beauty, but also grief. This was the long foretold day, the day the 13th Black Crusade had come to claim Cadia, the keystone of the Imperium's defences against the Eye of Terror. For 10,000 years, this world had stood defiant, its people bred not for peace, but for war. And yet, now, even the most steadfast Cadian could look at the horizon and see the truth in their heart. Nothing stands forever. Before we begin the story, know this: we truly care for you, more than you may realize. Your presence here means more than you can imagine. And so I must ask you, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now grab your coffee, and let's get started. On the planet's surface, among the towering bastions and defense lines, Lord Castellan Ursarkar E. Creed stood on a viewing platform high above Kasser Kraf. The wind tore at his greatcoat, carrying with it the smell of promethium, the tang of ozone from las-fire drills, and the faint, metallic scent of blood, the kind that lingers after years of constant readiness. His eyes were hard, but they were not the eyes of an unfeeling man. Deep within them lived a truth he would never speak aloud, that this was not a battle Cadia could win. Duty had shaped him into a commander feared by the enemy and revered by his soldiers. He had made impossible victories seem routine, bending the tide of war through cunning and unshakable will. But tonight, under a sky lit by falling wreckage, even Creed felt the heavy press of inevitability. He thought of the history carved into Cadia's bones, of ancestors who had died at these same walls, of the pylons that had stood longer than the Imperium itself, their true makers unknown. Those pylons hummed faintly now, their cyclopean forms casting shadows across the bastions. They were ancient, alien, and vital, their fields holding the warp's madness at bay, a silent bulwark against the Eye of Terror. Creed did not understand their making, but he understood their purpose. If they fell, Cadia would be consumed in a heartbeat. Behind him, Colonel Kell approached, his footsteps sharp against the ferrocrete. "The fleet's taking heavy losses, Lord Castellan," Kell said. "The orbital bastions can't keep up. Abaddon's hammering us with wave after wave." Creed didn't turn. "That's what I would do." Kell hesitated. "We can still break their momentum, sir. If we—" "No," Creed interrupted. "We hold the walls. No counterattacks until I say. They want us to bleed ourselves dry before the real blow comes." The words tasted bitter. He had fought too many wars not to recognize the pattern. The enemy was softening them, preparing the killing stroke. He could almost see the despoiler himself aboard his flagship, smiling in grim satisfaction as the trap closed. Beyond the horizon, the black silhouette of a warship tore through the atmosphere, leaving a burning contrail that split the sky. A moment later, the ground trembled. A dull, distant roar as the ship struck somewhere in the western plains. The sound was like the tolling of a funeral bell. Creed closed his eyes for a heartbeat, listening. He thought of the men and women in those cassers, of the civilians huddled in the deeper shelters. Most would never see another sunrise. He wondered if they understood the price they were about to pay, and if they would think it worth it. Kel's Vox bead crackled to life. Casa Craft Command, this is Fleet Command. Orbital bombardment commencing. Enemy warships in low atmosphere. All surface defenses prepare for impact. Above them, the first lance strikes flared. Burning lines of light falling from the heavens, slamming into the fortress walls with earth-shattering force. The ferrocrete shook beneath Creed's boots. Dust drifted from the ancient stonework. Alarms blared across the bastion. Creed gripped the rail and looked once more at the sky. The stars were fading behind smoke and fire. Somewhere out there, the first boarding torpedoes were already streaking toward Cadia's heart. This was it, the beginning of the end. And Ursarkar Creed, son of Cadia, swore silently that if Cadia must fall, it would fall standing. Cadia's walls had stood for 10 millennia, but the enemy was no longer just at the gates. It was already inside the hearts of those who manned them. Within the cavernous command halls of Casa Craft, the air was thick with the smell of burning oil, discharged laspacks, and the faint static tang of the Vox relays. Hollow screens flickered in the gloom, displaying maps of the surface war in stark green lines and shifting red markers. The voice of war never stopped here. The constant chatter of incoming reports was like the tide, always rising, never ceasing. Lord Castellan Ursarkar E. Creed stood at the centre table, hands resting on the cold steel rim, his eyes locked on the shifting front lines. Every few seconds, another green icon vanished, replaced by red. The room was full of activity, yet a strange tension hung over it. Something unspoken, something that gnawed at the edges of discipline. Creed had felt it growing since the first strikes. It was not just fear of the enemy's numbers or weapons. It was the sharp, sour taste of mistrust. Colonel Kell moved beside him, his expression grim. Another outpost. Fell silent, he said, voice low enough that only Creed could hear. Cassavan, perimeter 3. No distress call, no fighting reported. Just gone. Sabotage, Creed muttered. It wasn't a question. Before Kell could answer, the great blast doors opened with a hiss of hydraulics. Inquisitor Katarina Greyfax stepped inside, flanked by 2 silent black-armored stormtroopers. She was a blade of precision wrapped in human form. Tall, severe, her armor chased with gold, her wide-brimmed hat casting shadows across eyes that seemed to see straight into the soul. Castellan, she said without preamble, your perimeter is compromised. You have traitors in your command structure. Her words silenced the chamber. Officers paused at their consoles. Vox operators stopped mid-sentence. Even the distant sound of bombardment seemed to dim. Creed didn't look up from the table. I am aware of the possibility, Inquisitor. It is more than a possibility, she said sharply. My interrogators intercepted enemy communications. Specific troop movements, defensive codes, even rotation schedules have been passed to Abaddon's commanders. Someone here is feeding them our lifeblood. Creed raised his eyes then, meeting hers without flinching. Do you have a name? Not yet, Greyfax admitted, but I have suspicions. Kell shifted uneasily. And what do you propose, Inquisitor? A purge, she said simply. Immediate, interrogations, summary executions where necessary. Creed's jaw tightened. He had fought alongside the Ordo Hereticus before. He knew their methods. Purge the wrong man, and you hand the despoiler exactly what he wants. Chaos in our own lines. Greyfax stepped closer, lowering her voice so only he and Kell could hear. If you delay, you may have no lines left to defend. Before Creed could reply, another voice rang out from the far end of the chamber, clear, resonant, and utterly out of place in the cold war room. "Doubt is a poison, Lord Castellan," the voice said. The crowd parted to reveal Saint Celestine, flanked by her Gemini superior, their golden armor gleaming even in the harsh lumen light. She moved with the unhurried grace of one untouched by fear. In her hands, the ardent blade rested like an extension of her will, faint light dancing along its edge. Creed suppressed a sigh. Celestine had arrived only hours earlier, borne upon wings of light in the midst of the fiercest bombardment yet. Her presence had already spread through the troops like fire through dry grass, inspiring some, unsettling others. "You suggest trust," Creed said, his tone neutral. "I suggest faith," Celestine replied. "Your enemy will use your suspicion against you. Hold fast to one another, or you will crumble before the first wall falls." Greyfax's lips thinned. "Faith is no substitute for truth, Saint." "And truth without faith," Celestine answered softly, "is a blade that cuts only deeper." The two women locked eyes. Creed knew their conflict was older than this battle. The Inquisition saw saints as unpredictable, sometimes heretical anomalies. The ecclesiarchy saw inquisitors as cold hands that could choke out miracles before they bloomed. For now, he needed them both. He turned back to the hollow table, voice carrying enough weight to end the argument. "Until we have proof, there will be no purge. But we will double security protocols, encrypt all tactical data, and monitor every Vox channel. If the traitor makes another move, we will be ready." The officers returned to their duties, the momentary stillness breaking like ice underfoot. Yet the air still felt heavy, as if the shadows themselves were listening. Hours later, in the quiet of his private quarters, Creed stood at the single narrow window, looking toward the distant pylons. The sky was dark, but the hum of the ancient structures reached even here. Somewhere beyond them, the Black Fleet was still hammering the orbital bastions. Somewhere among his own officers, a traitor watched and waited. A soft chime broke the silence. His personal Vox link. He lifted the receiver, but no voice came. Only static, and beneath it, a whisper so faint it could have been imagined. "He is closer than you think." Creed lowered the receiver slowly. He did not sleep that night. The morning came without sunlight. The sky over Cadia was a wall of smoke, fire, and the gleam of metal leviathans hanging in low orbit. The constant rumble of bombardment had become the heartbeat of the world, a rhythm that told every man, woman, and child they were living on borrowed time. Lord Castellan Ursaca E. Creed stood on the western bastion of Casa Craft, the wind tearing at his coat, his eyes scanning the far horizon. There, where the land rolled into the grey distance, the enemy was massing. He could feel it, even before the Vox reports confirmed it. The long, dark shadow of the Black Legion's advance. Colonel Kell joined him, helm under one arm, las pistol at his hip. His voice was tight. "Sir, they've committed their Titans." Creed didn't look at him. "How many?" "At least 3 Warhound packs and 1 Warlord class. More signatures behind them. Possibly a second Warlord." Creed exhaled through his nose. "They mean to break us in one strike." The Vox in Kell's ear crackled. "Incoming. Orbital drop signatures. West quadrant, 500 meters beyond defensive line 3. The sky erupted. Black shapes screamed down through the clouds, trailing fire, drop pods, their hulls carved in the marks of the dark gods. They struck the plane with thunderous impacts, cratering the earth and sending shockwaves through the bastion walls. Seconds later, Their doors blew open in synchronized detonations, and the warriors of the Black Legion surged forth. The first was a Terminator, his armor a fortress of blackened ceramite, his helm adorned with the horns of some long-dead beast. In his fists, a chain fist roared to life, tearing through the air with teeth of steel. Behind him came scores of Chaos Space Marines, bolters barking, their shells leaving contrails of smoke in the toxic air. The Cadian line answered. Laser guns lit the plain in a storm of red, heavy bolters stitched the enemy advance with fire, and from the flanks, Lehman Russ tanks unleashed punishing salvos. The opening clash was like the meeting of two great storms, the land itself shaking under the weight of war. Creed's orders were crisp, almost cold, not because he lacked feeling, but because there was no room for hesitation. Sector 6, pour fire into their left flank. First artillery battery, target those Terminators. Infantry, hold the line, hold. Through the chaos, Creed's gaze shifted to the distant pylons. For centuries, they had stood as immovable guardians, their fields muting the warp's hunger. But now, something was wrong. One of the massive spires flickered faintly, its glow dimming before flaring again. Inquisitor Greyfax, Creed called over the command vox. Her voice came back sharp. I see it. That is no random fluctuation. Something is interfering with the pylon's field. Can it be fixed? Not while you are being overrun. The truth was as bitter as promethium fumes. If the pylons failed, the eye of terror would pour directly into Cadia's heart. At the base of the bastion, Chaos Terminators slammed into the first defensive line. The ferrocrete wall shuddered as chain fists and power maws tore chunks from it. Heavy weapons teams fought to hold the breach, but the sheer weight of the assault was unbearable. One by one, the bunkers went dark. Kell's voice was in Creed's ear. Casa Craft Command, breach in the western line. Enemy pouring through Sector 6. Fall back to secondary positions, Creed ordered. Make them pay for every step. Through the haze, a glint of gold drew his attention. Celestine, wings flared, descending into the thick of the fighting. Her sword cut arcs of pure light through the smoke, each strike felling a warrior of chaos. Around her, Cadians rallied, their laser guns finding new strength. For a moment, Creed allowed himself to believe they might hold, but faith could not stop the tide. The Black Legion pressed harder, their lines bolstered by towering hellbrutes and demon engines whose metallic screams tore through mortal minds. The bastion's walls groaned. Chunks of ferrocrete rained down like hail. Then came the sound Creed had dreaded, a deep, resonant boom that was not from artillery or titans. It came from the pylon field itself, the harmonic pitch warping like a dying note. Greyfax's voice cut through the din. They've sabotaged the field regulators, the pylon's failing. Creed turned from the wall. Seal the inner gates. If we lose Casa Craft, the whole sector falls. Kell's tone was grim. Understood. But sir, that means abandoning those still out there. Creed hesitated. The first pause he had allowed himself all day. He saw their faces in his mind, soldiers, friends, men and women who had trusted him. He forced the thought down like swallowing glass. Seal it, he said. The command was carried out. Massive adamantium gates ground shut with a sound like the closing of a tomb. Outside, the screams and gunfire were muffled, but not silenced. Hours later, as the last reports came in, Creed stood alone in the bastion's watchtower. Beyond the walls, the western plain was a wasteland of fire and ruin. The enemy had taken Casa Craft's outer lines. The first breach had been made. The days that followed were a strange twilight in the history of the Imperium. Terra, still draped in the full serenity of preparation, moved like a living organism bracing for a mortal wound. The air was heavy with incense and dust. The great bells of the ecclesiarchy tolled with slow, deliberate rhythm, echoing like the heartbeat of a dying giant. The walls of the imperial palace, impossibly high and layered in adamantium and faith, were both a comfort and a curse. They stood as a testament to the emperor's vision, yet also as a reminder that his enemies were so great, so relentless, that even such fortifications might fail. Within the Hall of Eternity, the Emperor sat upon the golden throne, his gaze fixed not upon the mortals who bustled about in service, but upon the unseen threads of fate that stretched across the galaxy. The psychic pressure radiating from him was palpable. Even the most battle-hardened custodians felt their knees weaken in his presence. At his side, Malcador the Sigillite worked tirelessly, orchestrating the labyrinthine defences, moving fleets like pieces on a game board that spanned 1,000,000 worlds. His expression betrayed no fear, but his eyes, those deep, knowing eyes, carried the weight of a man who understood exactly how little time remained. Far from the throne, in the barracks of the Legio Custodes, armour was polished to a mirror shine, though none took joy in the ritual. The warriors spoke little, for words felt hollow in the shadow of what approached. Each man, each living demigod of the Emperor, knew that the battles to come would test not only their skill, but their will to stand against the impossible. The Space Marines, who had been recalled to Terra, prepared in grim silence. Some sharpened blades that had tasted the blood of Xenos kings. Others prayed in whispers to the Emperor, though many knew such prayers were answered not with deliverance, but with strength to endure. And beyond the walls, in the outer defences of the Sol system, the void fleets gathered. Billions of tons of warships aligned in patient formation, their prows pointed toward the darkness where Horus's fleet would one day appear. The silence of the void was deceptive. The calm before the storm is always the most unnerving, for in that silence lay the knowledge that somewhere beyond the edge of sight, the War Master gathered his legions, preparing to break the spine of the Imperium. When the storm came, there would be no retreat. The void was vast, cold, and unfeeling. But it was never truly silent. In the deep dark beyond the reach of starlight, the immaterium churned like a sea of nightmares. Even without mortal ears to hear it, the warp whispered. Its voices slid through the cracks of reality, wrapping themselves around the minds of the weak, the desperate, and the damned. Somewhere within that roiling madness, Horus Lupercal dreamed. He stood upon the ashes of 1,000,000 burning worlds, his armour blackened by war, his hand gripping the talon gifted to him by the dark gods. The skies above were choked with smoke, and the cries of the dying rose like a hymn to his glory. But beneath the triumph was something else, a shadow, deep and gnawing. A voice called to him, sweet and venomous, promising victory over his father, over the lies of the Imperium, over the chains of destiny. In the waking world, aboard the vengeful spirit, Horus's mortal crew went about their duties in reverent silence, afraid to break the trance their War Master had entered. They did not see the flickering shapes that twisted along the walls of his private sanctum, nor the faint shimmer of taloned shadows that slid across the floor. The Primarch stirred. His eyes opened, but they were not the same eyes that had once looked upon the Emperor with loyalty and love. These were the eyes of a man reforged in the crucible of betrayal, and in their depths burned a power that was not wholly his own. Far across the galaxy, astropaths on Terra writhed in agony. They could not hear Horus's thoughts, but they felt the warp boil with his malice. The Astronomicon flickered for a heartbeat, an event so rare and so ominous that the High Lords paused their council. Even the Emperor, still bound to the golden throne, lifted his head slightly, as though sensing a ripple in the ocean of fate. On the outer edges of the Sol system, the first anomalies began to appear. Long-range augers detected shadows where there should have been none, faint distortions in the void, as though something vast was moving just beyond the edge of perception. Imperial Navy commanders tightened formations, and prayers were whispered in the command decks of battleships. Malcador, ever the watcher, stood before the massive star charts in his chamber. His fingers traced the shifting lights of the galaxy, and his expression darkened. "The storm gathers," he murmured, almost to himself, "and its heart beats in the chest of the son who would slay his father." The warp grew restless. Somewhere in that endless sea of madness, the gods smiled. The Sol system had always been the most heavily defended region of the Imperium. Fortress moons bristled with macro cannons, planetary shields shimmered like walls of light, and the void between planets was patrolled by the most disciplined fleets humanity had ever assembled. Generations of admirals had drilled their crews with a single truth: if the enemy ever came here, it would be the last battle humanity would fight. And now, in the far reaches beyond Pluto's orbit, the enemy had come. It began with faint augur echoes, phantom signatures dancing across the Auspex screens of the phalanx, the immense mobile fortress of the Imperial fists. At first, the readings were dismissed as interference from the constant warp turbulence that had plagued the galaxy in recent years. But as the hours passed, the distortions grew sharper, more defined, until their shapes became unmistakable. Ships, thousands of them. The outermost picket ships of Battlefleet Solar were the first to sight the approaching armada. Vox channels crackled with half-panicked reports. Unidentified vessels on approach, their hulls jagged with unfamiliar corruption, their banners bearing the eye of Horus. Before any order could be given, the first exchange was made. A lone Imperial frigate fired its lance batteries in defiance. The return volley from the traitors was a storm of plasma and macro shells that ripped the ship apart in a blossom of fire. From that moment, the siege had begun. In the strategium of the phalanx, Rogel Dawn stood like a statue carved from stone, his yellow armor catching the glow of the holoprojectors. Every new report confirmed the same truth. Horus had brought the largest war fleet ever assembled in human history. Titans of the void, battleships the size of cities, sailed beside demon-haunted cruisers, their hulls shimmering with unnatural light. Between them, the swarming mass of escort ships moved like a living tide. "Signal every bastion, every gun platform, every ship in system," Dawn commanded. His voice was as calm as it was absolute. "Tell them the war is here." Malcador's arrival was silent, yet the atmosphere in the chamber shifted the moment he appeared. "You cannot stop them all," he warned, his gaze meeting Dawn's, "but you can bleed them and buy the Emperor time." Dawn did not look away. "I will hold terror, or I will die upon its walls." Far beyond their sight, the traitor vanguard tore through the first defensive ring. Worlds that had known peace for centuries burned in hours. The warp bled into real space, and the void was filled with the screams of ships dying in flame. Amidst it all, the vengeful spirit glided forward like a predator, Horus upon its bridge, smiling. The War Master could already see the Imperial Palace in his mind. Soon, his boots would tread its marble halls, and his father's throne would be drowned in blood. The first signs of the enemy came not as a roar, but as a whisper. Astropaths across the Sol system screamed in unison, their minds assaulted by visions of burning worlds and the laughter of gods who had no right to exist. Some died instantly, their souls torn apart by the psychic feedback. Others were left hollow-eyed, whispering names that no human tongue should know. The Imperial Palace's communication spires shuddered under the onslaught, entire data vaults burning out from the sheer volume of corrupted transmissions. From the throne, the Emperor's mind stretched outward like a blazing sun, burning through the warp storms to pierce the darkness. What he saw was not a fleet, but an entire tide of nightmares. The War Master's vanguard, a swarm of traitor vessels so vast that no single human mind could comprehend its scope. Warships once sworn to terror now bore the icons of blasphemy, their hulls adorned with the trophies of slaughtered worlds. In the upper atmosphere of terror, the first orders were given: planetary void shields to maximum strength, orbital defense platforms primed to fire, and all incoming civilian traffic halted. The great space lanes that had once been arteries of trade and pilgrimage were sealed, leaving countless vessels stranded at the edge of the Sol system. In the barracks of the Imperial Fists, Rogel Dawn stood among his warriors like a living bastion. His voice, calm yet heavy with purpose, carried over the Vox to every legionary on terror. The storm has come. There will be no second chance. You stand between terror and the abyss, and you will not break. The people of terror felt the shift, even if they could not name it. The sky seemed darker, the air colder, and the sacred bells rang not in celebration, but in mourning for the peace that had just died. In the far reaches of the Sol system, the outermost picket fleets reported their last transmissions before being consumed by the War Master's spearhead. Some messages were coherent calls for aid. Others were raw, chaotic screaming before the Vox went dead. The siege had not yet begun, but already terror was under attack, not by guns or blades, but by fear. The War Master had learned long ago that terror was the most efficient weapon. And as night fell over the throne world, the first true darkness of the heresy touched its heart. The war did not arrive at terror in a single hammer blow. It came like a tide, grinding away at every wall before the killing wave struck. At the edge of the Sol system, the Phalanx stood in orbit around Pluto's fortress moon. The massive star fortress, pride of the Imperial Fists, shone like a golden spear point against the void. But against the War Master's armada, even such a weapon would be tested beyond all limits. The traitor fleet came in layered waves, spearhead squadrons of the Sons of Horus, flanked by the gun line of the Iron Warriors, with the Night Lords darting like predatory shadows between them. Their opening salvo lit the darkness with 1,000 points of fire, the void itself seeming to split apart under the weight of their guns. Pluto's bastions responded in kind. Macro cannons roared, defense lasers cut lances through enemy ranks, and minefields detonated in controlled bursts, tearing apart strike craft by the hundreds. For 3 days and 3 nights of constant engagement, the defenders held, their losses mounting, but their resolve unbroken. But the traitors had no intention of fighting a fair war. The Alpha Legion had already infiltrated deep into the outer stations before the battle began, sabotaging power grids, corrupting targeting cogitators, and opening breaches at the worst possible moments. Entire battalions of loyalist solar auxilia found themselves surrounded by enemies wearing their own uniforms. When the Iron Warriors finally breached Pluto's primary shield grid, the fortress moon's fate was sealed. Boarding torpedoes crashed through its armor, spilling thousands of traitor Astartes into the corridors. The fighting became a labyrinth of kill zones, bolter fire echoing in metal halls, chainswords screaming through smoke. Loyalists fought room by room, corridor by corridor, knowing there would be no reinforcement. In the void, the phalanx burned its main thrusters, tearing free of its anchorage to engage the enemy directly. Its guns ripped apart entire cruisers in single, punishing broadsides. But even that colossus could not stem the tide. Rogel Dawn, watching from Terra, gave the order no commander ever wishes to give. Disengage. Fall back to the inner system. Pluto is lost. The remaining loyalist ships retreated under covering fire, their holds heavy with wounded and their hearts heavier still. Behind them, Pluto burned, its atmosphere boiling away, its once proud defenses now silent tombs of steel and ash. The loss was more than strategic. It was a wound to the spirit of Terra's defenders, proof that even the outermost bastions could fall. The enemy was closer now, and every mile of space they crossed brought the nightmare to the throne world's gates. The retreat from Pluto did not bring relief. It brought the enemy to the very edge of Saturn's domain. The ringed world system of moons had long been fortified into a sprawling bastion, a chain of defense platforms, orbital stations, and fleet anchorages known collectively as the Saturnine Ring. It was the second wall of Terra's bulwark, and it would not be surrendered without cost. Here, the Imperial Navy had massed what remained of its outer fleets. Battleships bearing the proud sigils of the Segmentum Solar took station alongside rogue trader armadas and Mechanicus war barges. Titan pattern defense monitors clung to the orbital rings of Saturn, their plasma coils already glowing with murderous intent. The Saturnine fleet waited, a blade drawn and ready. The War Master's vanguard arrived in the storm of warp light, reality tearing open to spill forth the greatest concentration of traitor ships since the opening of the heresy. The Word-Bearers' battle barges advanced alongside the Iron Warriors' siege hulks, while the Sons of Horus formed the spear point. Behind them, the World Eaters boarding, cruisers loomed like predators scenting blood. The opening exchange was nothing short of cataclysmic. Saturn's defensive grid unleashed a synchronized barrage that shattered an entire squadron of Night Lord's destroyers in the first minute of combat. In answer, the traitor fleet's combined firepower fell upon the loyalist lines like the wrath of gods. Void shields flared, hulls cracked, and whole decks were torn into the void. The battle became a slaughterhouse in space. Every moon and station was its own battlefield. Enceladus's ice crust split under the impact of orbital bombardment, geysers of frozen vapor boiling into nothingness. Titan's forges burned as Mechanicus defenders fought to keep critical supply lines open, while traitor Astartes landed in massed drop pod waves. The Saturnine Ring began to buckle under the relentless hammering. The Iron Warriors targeted the linchpin station, Primus Bastion, whose command relays coordinated half the defensive grid. Despite valiant counterattacks, the bastion's shields collapsed under concentrated fire, and the enemy poured inside. The corridors became a maze of steel and blood. Las fire reflecting off oil-slick walls, chain axes grinding against ceramite. Admiral Viren, commander of the Saturn defense, knew the moment the tide had turned. In his final transmission to Terra, his voice was calm, almost serene. We will hold as long as we are able. Till dawn, the road is bought in blood. The last act of the defenders was as defiant as it was desperate. Viren ordered the remains of his fleet to charge the traitor battleships head-on, ramming and detonating plasma cores at point-blank range. Massive shockwaves tore through the combat zone, annihilating friend and foe alike. In that chaos, a fraction of the surviving loyalist ships fled toward Jupiter, carrying with them the grim news: Saturn had fallen. As the traitor banners rose over the shattered moons, the War Master's path to terror stood clearer than ever. 2 walls had been broken. Only the inner system remained. The battle for the Eternity Gate had raged for what seemed like lifetimes. The stones were no longer grey. They were black and red, scorched by the fires of plasma and drenched in the blood of warriors whose names would never be remembered. The air was thick, choking with the metallic stench of gore and the acrid bite of promethium smoke. Above it all, the hollow toll of the great bells of terror echoed, not to summon hope, but to mark the hours until the end. The Emperor sat unmoving upon the golden throne, his mortal shell weakened, yet his mind burning with godlike fury. Every psychic sense within him could feel the warp storm swelling beyond the veil. Demons clawed at reality itself, their shrieks merging with the wails of the dying. But the Emperor's gaze was fixed upon the final gate, his gate, where his sons fought and bled to keep the enemy from breaching the sanctum. At the forefront, Rogel Dawn stood like a wall of ceramite and will, his armor battered and splattered with the ichor of creatures that should never have walked in the material realm. His shield arm hung limp, a demon blade having severed the muscle, yet he fought on, every blow from his power fist shattering bone, armor, and the unnatural forms of the warpspawn. Beside him, Sanguinius was a vision of both beauty and doom. His white wings now stained crimson, his blade singing as it reaped life after life. But above them, circling like a shadow in the smog-choked skies, came the winged terror that had once been a Primarch. Angron, the Red Angel, driven to madness beyond mortal reckoning. His eyes burned like molten brass, his flesh twisted and remade in the image of the blood god. Each strike of his chain axes sent shockwaves through the ranks of defenders. No mortal or Astartes could stand before him for more than a heartbeat. Only Sanguinius could meet his fury. They clashed in the shadow of the gate. 2 brothers, 2 angels, one born of light, the other drowned in rage. Each blow rang like the toll of doom, each parry a prayer unspoken. The air itself trembled under their contest, the ground splintering beneath their feet. Meanwhile, within the sanctum, Malcador the Sigillite was dying. His frail body, so long sustained by will alone, was breaking under the psychic weight of the Emperor's absence from the warp. Blood ran from his nose and ears as he whispered wards to keep the demons at bay. Even in his agony, he smiled faintly, for he knew his purpose was nearly complete. Soon he would be gone, and the Emperor would face Horus alone. Then it happened, the moment no one could halt. A breach in the gate. The walls groaned and shuddered as an impossible force tore through adamantium and stone. The defenders were hurled back like dust in a storm. Through the rift strode the traitor legions, their banners dripping with filth, their war cries echoing like the screams of the damned. At their head was the War Master himself, though still distant. His presence was a shadow upon the hearts of men, a crushing weight that made even the most loyal falter. Rogel Dawn roared his defiance, rallying what few remained. The Emperor rose, his psychic aura flooding the throne room with golden light. Time was ending. The blood upon the throne was not just that of kings and gods. It was the blood of an age, the final payment for the golden dream that had been Terra's crown. And in the last light of that age, the Emperor knew the truth. To save mankind, he would have to kill his son. The sky above Terra was a turbulent ocean of fire and shadow, each streak of burning debris marking the death of another ship, another crew, another sworn protector of the throne. The Void War had become a relentless grind, and the battle below was no different. Each hour a tithe of blood extracted from the Imperium's defenders. Within the basalt walls of the Imperial Palace, the air was thick with the weight of vows. Here, amidst the war councils and tactical chambers, the Emperor's chosen generals clashed with words sharper than any blade. Rogel Dawn stood unyielding, his voice a cold anvil against which all argument broke. His oaths were forged in duty, each syllable a chain binding him to the defense of the throne world. Opposite him, Sanguinius stood like a storm barely restrained. The angel bore his burden with a grace that belied the fury coiled within his heart. His visions had shown him the cost of this war, his own death among them, yet he did not shrink from the path. Every word he spoke carried the weight of that foreknowledge, each one a promise to bleed until the final breath for the sake of humanity. Mortarian's forces had breached the outer spires of the Saturnine Gate, their poisoned siege engines belching corruption into the air. In the darkened halls beneath the palace, Imperial fists and blood angels fought side by side, their banners shredded, their armor caked with soot and gore. Chains of oath and blood bound them together here, promises to Primarch, Emperor and brother alike. But not all chains were of honor. Far in the labyrinth beneath the palace, the word-bearers wove their dark sermons, corrupting captured soldiers and servants. These were oaths of another kind, pacts made not in loyalty, but in whispered blasphemy. Every heart they turned, every oath they twisted, was another crack in the fortress of faith. The Emperor, seated upon the golden throne, heard none of these debates in the mortal sense, yet he knew them all. Their voices were threads in the great tapestry of the siege. Each choice and vow a knot in the web of fate he struggled to hold together. Yet even he felt the pull. Oaths could bind the strong, but they could also drag them into the abyss. As night fell over Terra, the two Primarchs, one the angel, one the Praetorian, stood atop the palace walls, looking out over the battlefield lit by fire and death. Between them lay a silent understanding. They would die before letting those gates fall. Whether by loyalty, prophecy, or sheer defiance, their chains were the same. The wind tore at their cloaks, carrying with it the distant cries of men and the thunder of war. In that moment, the chains of oath and blood held firm. The night upon Terra was a false one. There was no peace in the darkness, only the hellish glow of orbital fire and the relentless rumble of artillery that shook the bones of the very palace. Smoke and dust blotted out the stars, and the planet itself seemed to groan under the strain of so much death. The Saturnine Gate, pride of Dawn's fortifications, had withstood every test the traitors had hurled against it. But now, under the foul hand of Perturabo, the Iron Warrior's masterstroke unfolded. For weeks, their siege engines had pounded the walls, their artillery searching for weaknesses in the web of defences. All the while their sappers dug deeper, carving labyrinthine tunnels beneath the earth like a cancer spreading through stone. When the breach came, it was not heralded by trumpets or a roar. It came with a shuddering groan deep below the surface, like the death rattle of the mountain itself. Then the earth exploded upward, swallowing towers and battlements in a geyser of molten rock, steel, and shattered men. Into that wound poured the enemy, iron warriors in their dull grey plate, death guard wreathed in pestilence, and the endless tide of mortal cultists, their howls thick with madness. The defenders fought like legends of old. Imperial fists locked shields, bolt guns spitting in disciplined volleys. Blood angels crashed into the foe with a fury unmatched, their golden armor blackened by soot, their wings trailing fire in the smoke-choked night. Each meter of ground was bought with rivers of blood. High above the breach, Dawn himself descended into the fray, his great blade carving swathes through the iron warriors. He was the wall, the foundation, the unbroken stone. Sanguinius too was there, the angel moving like a spear of light through the chaos. To see him was to believe victory was possible, if only for a heartbeat. But the traitors were relentless. Perturabo's warriors pressed forward with mechanical precision, their siege masters calculating every kill, every advance, as though it were another brick laid in a fortress of death. The Death Guard, led by Typhon, poisoned the very air, so that every breath the defenders took was a battle in itself. Hours blurred into eternity. The breach was sealed in blood more than stone, the bodies of the fallen forming a grotesque barricade. Yet by dawn, or what passed for dawn under the smoke, Saturnine still stood. It had not fallen, but it was cracked, and in that crack, the seeds of the palace's undoing had been sown. Dawn knew it, Perturabo knew it, and somewhere in the dark, Horus smiled. The breach at Saturnine had been contained, but the cost was written in the endless lines of stretchers, in the hollow eyes of the survivors, and in the empty places where heroes had once stood. Even as rubble was cleared and makeshift barricades raised, the defenders knew that what had been lost could never be reclaimed. In the high halls of the inner palace, Sanguinius stood upon a balcony, his gaze cast across the broken plains of the outer defences. From here, Terra was a graveyard. Towering spires that had once been symbols of the Imperium's glory now stood shattered, wreathed in fire. The air itself was thick with the rot of the Death Guard's gifts and the acrid smoke of burning cities. The angel's armour was dented and scorched, his once brilliant wings dulled by ash. Yet his eyes still shone, not with hope, but with a terrible clarity. He had seen the threads of fate in his dreams, visions of a future drenched in shadow. He knew his path was short, and that each step brought him closer to the throne room, and to his end. Beside him stood Rogel Dawn, ever the fortress incarnate. The two spoke little, for there was no need. Both knew the war could not be won in the traditional sense. All that could be done was to buy time, to hold, no matter the cost, until the Emperor himself could act. Yet time was a currency the defenders no longer possessed in abundance. Perturabo's relentless siege engines ground forward, their bombardment never ceasing. Horus's forces had begun to infiltrate through the lower catacombs, guided by treachery from within. Loyalist regiments vanished without trace, their absence noticed only when the enemy appeared in their stead. In the refugee districts, fear had turned to madness. The masses huddled in the shadow of the palace walls, whispering that the Emperor had abandoned them. Riots broke out, and whispers of dark promises from the War Master's agents spread like wildfire. But Sanguinius still walked among them. Without ceremony or entourage, the angel descended into the camps, his presence a balm against despair. To those who saw him, the war was not yet lost. He carried the wounded, blessed the dying, and even in the depths of exhaustion, found words to lift the hearts of soldiers who could barely lift their weapons. Every night, when the sky burned with the light of orbital bombardment, Sanguinius would return to the battlements. He would stand alone for hours, watching the darkness beyond the walls. The legionaries of the Blood Angels called it the Angel's Vigil. Some swore they saw his lips moving in silent prayer, others that he spoke to the Emperor himself. But in truth, Sanguinius was not praying for salvation. He was preparing himself, for he knew the walls would break, the enemy would enter, and that when they did, it would be he, alone, who must stand in their path. And far above, aboard the vengeful spirit, Horus felt the faint brush of his brother's mind. He smiled, for the game was unfolding exactly as he had foreseen. The golden throne loomed above all, its radiant light casting a pale glow across the shattered marble of the Sanctum Imperialis. Outside its walls, the war still raged, but within, the air was thick with a far deeper battle, one of whispers, doubt, and silent blades waiting to strike. Once loyal generals stood apart from one another, their eyes sharp and calculating. Alliances forged over centuries now fractured under the unbearable weight of suspicion. Every word felt like a test, every movement a threat. For even as the Emperor prepared his final stand against the forces clawing at the gates of terror, within his own walls, seeds of betrayal had begun to sprout. Rogel Dawn paced before the throne's dais, his armor still cracked from the last engagement. He had returned not only to repair his strength, but to ensure the palace's defense remained intact. Yet, despite his vigilance, he could not silence the gnawing thought that the true danger might not come from the walls being breached, but from those inside them. Some speak of retreat, Dawn growled, his voice heavy with disdain, as if terror itself could be abandoned, as if our oaths mean nothing. Not all who question are traitors, countered Malcador the Sigillite, his voice calm but sharp, like a blade hidden beneath velvet. His eyes lingered on the shadows behind the pillars, where the custodians stood like statues, silent, watchful, but perhaps too still. Rumors had spread through the palace, of covert transmissions intercepted, of warriors vanishing into the dark without report, of doors unlocked where they should have been sealed. No one admitted it aloud, but all felt the cold breath of treachery at their necks. The Emperor, silent upon his throne, gave no sign of acknowledgement, though his eyes burned brighter than the throne's own light. Was it fury? Was it sorrow? None could tell. Yet those who met his gaze found themselves turning away, as though their very thoughts were laid bare. As the night deepened, Malcador summoned his most trusted agents. Quietly, he dispatched them into the labyrinthine halls of the palace. Their orders were clear. Find the source of the whispers, unmask the serpent before it strikes. But the deeper they went, the more they discovered that the serpent's coils were everywhere. Even the most loyal could not deny it now. The enemy was not only at the gates. The enemy was here. The night before the final assault upon the imperial palace was unlike any other. Across Terra, the fires of war dimmed for a fleeting moment, not because the enemy relented, but because both sides were gathering their strength for the end. The air was heavy with smoke, the sky a churning sea of blood-red clouds, lit by the burning wrecks of ships that still fell from orbit like dying stars. From the walls of the Sanctum Imperialis, Rogel Dawn stood in silence, his hands gripping the cold stone battlements. The storms in the upper atmosphere raged like an angry god, but his gaze was fixed on the endless tide of darkness gathering beyond the palace's outer ring. He could see the enemy moving, endless ranks of corrupted warriors, demonic monstrosities, and siege engines dragged forward by chains thicker than a man's torso. Inside, the mood was tense. The Emperor remained upon his throne, still silent, still watching, his will stretching far beyond the walls to hold the webway closed against the horrors within. Every moment he sat there, he bled his strength into the war beyond mortal sight. And yet, in that terrible stillness, those who served him could feel a quiet resolve radiating from his presence, the unspoken command to fight to the very last breath. Malcador walked the corridors that night, speaking little, but observing much. He passed custodians, sisters of silence, and weary space marines, each preparing in their own way for what they knew would come with the dawn. The sigillite paused often, his thoughts heavy. He knew that after tomorrow, the galaxy would never again be as it was. Whether they won or lost, the Imperium's golden age was already gone. Elsewhere, warriors wrote their final messages to comrades far across the stars, or to loved ones they had not seen in decades. Chaplains offered prayers in a dozen dialects, their voices echoing against cracked cathedral walls. Apothecaries worked without pause, repairing armor and tending wounds they knew would soon reopen. The smell of oil, blood, and incense filled every hall. When the first faint light of dawn touched the horizon, the drums began, deep, resonant, and slow, echoing across the ruined spires of the throne world. From beyond the gates, the enemy roared in answer, a sound like 1,000 worlds screaming in unison. The final day had come. Above them, the sun was pale and veiled in smoke, but its light still fell upon the banners of the Imperium. Torn though they were, they still flew, and as long as they flew, terror would not fall.